So this is panel 2 of our 3 panels today, the second of our 4 events, feminism and intersectionality. If you did join us earlier, welcome back. If not, welcome for the first time. And I will be passing you over to Claire Lees, who is chairing this event, to introduce our lovely speakers for today. So thank you, Claire.
Thanks very much, Natalia. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Claire Lees, as Natalia just said. I'm the director of the Institute for English Studies at the School of Advanced Study. And true to the school's disciplinary and multidisciplinary remit, we have 3 speakers from 3 different disciplines this afternoon, choosing to challenge, to pick up the theme for International Women's Day, choosing to challenge the intersections between intersectionality and feminism, and speaking from their work in philosophy, literature, and law. A quick moment to reminder about questions and answers. We will take those at the end. You can post your questions in the Q&A and I'll pick them up from there. We're going to take 3 papers in sequence. And I will introduce the whole panel, and then we will return to the questions and answers. So our first speaker today is Sophie Grace Chappell, and I've pronounced it all wrong already, Chappell, from the Open University. They are a philosopher and work across an amazing range of subject areas within philosophy. Today, their paper is entitled Adoption, Co-options and Welcomes, Making Social Space for Transgender People. And their most recent book, I just want to give a quick plug for a new book. Their most recent book is provisionally titled, and I love the title, Epiphanies and Ethics and Meta-Ethics of Experience. Our second speaker is Ruvani Ranasinghe from King's College London, where she works in post-colonial literature and contemporary literature and film, particularly in relation to South Asia and South Asian diaspora, with a focus on gender, immigration, and the cultural representation of Muslim identity in the West. Her most recent book, I think, though she'll correct me if I'm wrong, is Contemporary South Asian Women's Fiction from Palgrave. And her title today is the elegantly titled Feminism and Intersectionality, Women Writers of Colour. And we conclude, though we don't conclude the panel, but we conclude the speaker session with Lisa Webley, who is from the law school at Birmingham University, whose research addresses the regulation, education, ethicality, and professionalism of the legal profession. She seems to advise an incredible array of government policy initiatives and the European Commission, and we always like people who do that, particularly now. Her title of her paper is The Enduring Relevance of Gender, Race and Class Within the Legal Profession in England and Wales. So we will start with no further ado with Sophie Grace Chappell.
Thank you, Claire. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted and excited to be part of this event, and I've got quite a lot to say. I'll try and keep it brief, 15 minutes as required. First of all, it's always worth reminding ourselves why we still need an event like this. We live in a country, I saw this in the newspaper the other day, we live in a country where women are still afraid to take exercise outdoors on their own. And under the current lockdown, of course, that's a particularly grave restriction on their personal freedom. Women, there's an epidemic of violence against women in Britain today, and worldwide. It's horrifying, and we simply have to find ways of stopping it. And so it's as important as ever to keep up the fight for equality and for fairness and for protection for women from a variety of threats that they face today, and which I'm afraid there are still so many signs in our society that these threats are just not taken seriously, and they've got to be. So I'm privileged to be speaking here. I'm delighted to be speaking here as a trans woman, a fairly overt one. Some trans women go under the radar. They live lives where people, unless they know them very well and have known them for years, they don't know they're trans women. They just see them as women without the trans prefix, or as cis women, if you want to use that prefix, which really just means woman but not a trans woman. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of the ways in which trans women have recently been taken to be a group, which is a kind of Aunt Sally for columnists in tabloid newspapers and right-wing politicians to knock around. That's one of the reasons why it doesn't actually make sense, because some of us are visibly trans women. I suppose I am, for example, much though I'd like to pass. And some of us are not visibly trans women. And so the idea that we form a clear, simple group that can be, well, in-grouped or out-grouped, is a kind of mistake that we need to fight, I think. And simple facts go such a long way in defeating prejudice in this area. Just getting the facts straight is a great help, I think, in this debate. So the facts about any trans woman are, or any trans person, the facts that you find yourself confronted with in your life have to do with having a sense of who you are, a profound sense of what your body is, what your bodily identity is, which doesn't square with the biology that you're born with. And the fact is that the best way to live with that disparity between the way you're born and the way you understand yourself, the way you think your body should be, the way you feel at home being, the best way to deal with that disparity is to live in the other gender from the one that you were assigned at birth. And as I say, for some people, that's a journey that stops at a point where it's visible that they've taken that journey still. For other people, it's a journey which goes all the way to becoming what in the trans community we sometimes call submarines, becoming people who are not visible, not visibly trans at all. Well, my own journey goes on, and I'm delighted that I've taken this journey. It's been transformative. It's hugely improved my life that this has happened, and I hope it's improved the lives of those around me, in as much as it's made me a less intolerable person to have to be with than I perhaps used to be. I want to talk very quickly today, in the next 10 minutes or so, about making social space for transgender people and making space for them, as space has been made for me here, and I'm very grateful for it, amongst women's groups with other women who are cis women. And that's a possibility which is real. And a lot of time and effort in philosophy is, in my own discipline, is devoted to thinking about this question as a metaphysical question. And I don't want to say that that's wrong. I'm not against trying to work out a better theory of gender, a better account of what it is to be a woman, based upon metaphysics, based upon science and biology, and based upon sociology, based upon the social status, the standing of being a woman. I'm not against that kind of philosophical enterprise at all. But what I want to say is that there's a sense in which it doesn't actually matter how that enterprise goes, because there's an element of decision about this. We have the decision whether we're going to accept trans women as women, or whether we're going to behave like Rod Liddell towards them, or Graham Linehan, or whoever. We have that decision, and in a sense, it's up to us how we want to think about that and how we want to take our society forward or backward. So a little anecdote and then a couple of analogies. The anecdote is this. This is something that happened in my church on Mother's Day a few years ago. One might, I suppose, have various opinions about Mother's Day and indeed about the whole business of church, but leaving all that aside, I just want to tell one little anecdote. There was in our congregation at that time a trans woman who we may call Paula, and Paula had been in the congregation for a while and had transitioned during her time in the congregation, and Paula and someone else in the congregation were also parents of 3 children who were members of the congregation. And on Mother's Day, the children went off to Sunday school for most of the service and then came back at the piece, roughly 2/3 of the way through the service. And the Sunday school teacher had said to all the children, here's a daffodil, because it was close to St. David's Day. Here's a daffodil. I want you to give this daffodil to every mother that you see, or I want every mother in the congregation to get a daffodil. So go out. This is a day for women who are parents. Go out and give a daffodil so that every mother in the congregation has one. And so the children swarmed into the congregation, the daffodils were distributed. And I saw one of the children, looking at Paula and hesitating. And this child wasn't quite sure what to do. And eventually, because the child knew the history, knew that Paula was a trans woman, and eventually the child squared his shoulders and walked up to Paula and presented Paula with the daffodil. And Paula graciously accepted it. And I thought, that's great. That child didn't seek guidance. That child made his own decision about whether to accept Paula as a parent and a woman, and therefore as a mother. And this is how the reasoning went. And the child presented Paula with the daffodil. And that is a sign to Paula that she's included, that we recognize her as a woman, and we don't treat her as some kind of freak or exception. We include her in. And I thought that was a lovely gesture. So that's the kind of thing I mean by saying that it's up to us whether or not we include trans women. And there isn't any huge metaphysical barrier to including trans women. There isn't any reason why we can't include them. And if we think that there is some metaphysical reason why it's impossible to count trans women as women, that's a decision that we've taken. It's not something that the facts force us into. Now, this kind of standing of being a woman, even though you weren't born with female biology, as I'm saying, it's something that is socially conferred by our decision, and it's possible for us to do that. And here are some other cases where an identity can become the identity that you have through that kind of social recognition and through that kind of social decision. The Statutes of King's College, Cambridge, apocryphally used to include the following clauses. 16b, no dog shall be permitted within the grounds of the college. 16b, subsection 1, for the purposes of these statutes, any pet animal belonging to the provost of kings shall be deemed to be a cat. So that's a decision to count something as a cat, even though on the face of it, there seems to be good reason for saying that it's not a cat. It's given the status of a cat because that's what we decide to do. Here's another story. I was in a department meeting and we were waiting for other people to get there. There was myself, one professor, another professor, and there was the department secretary. And the third professor rushed in, looked around and said, so we're only 3 people in the meeting today, are we? Now that, I think, was incredibly rude of the third professor who'd just arrived, because there were 4 people in the room, right? There were 3 academics and the department secretary. So what the professor was saying there, by the way that he counted the people in the room, was that the secretary didn't count, literally didn't count. She was invisible to him. Now, he may have meant something like, we need a meeting that's quorumed, and the quorum for the department meeting has to be department members or academics. He might have meant something like that. He might have been speaking hastily. But on the face of it, what he said was pretty rude because it was so exclusionary. And what I'm saying is exclusion like that is a choice. You can make it, or you can decide not to make it. It's up to you. Now, this mutability of concepts, if I was to talk through the whole of this 11-page paper that I got on my laptop here, and from which into which I'm dipping, and from which I'm borrowing to make this presentation, if I was to read through the whole paper, I would be talking in a more general way about the mutability of concepts, because I want to make the point that it's not just in the case of trans women and trans men, trans people, that there's been this kind of flexing of our concepts. More historically, if you look around, you will see that all sorts of concepts have flexed and changed over time. Concepts are what philosophers call concrete universals. They're not just abstract or off in some Platonic heaven. They are part of the way that we humans understand our world. They're part of the way we divide up reality. And as time goes on, they're all changing all the time. As time goes on, we find better and more perspicuous ways of defining our reality and understanding the world around us. And that doesn't just happen with trans women and trans men and women. That doesn't just happen even with what ethicists call the thick ethical concepts. It doesn't just happen with our ethical ideas. It happens right across the board, even, for example, with our notion of number. If you go onto Wikipedia and look up, if you look up Fibonacci, Leonardo Fibonacci, as in the Fibonacci number sequence, which you may have heard of. Fibonacci, there's a wonderful article on Wiki about him. I do a lot of research on Wiki, and I'm not even ashamed of it. Fibonacci is famous for the Fibonacci numbers, which are a certain sequence of natural numbers. But his big achievement, actually, was to get the West using the Arabic numbering system instead of the Roman numbering system. The Roman numbering system is extremely clunky, extremely difficult to manipulate. Just try multiplying 2000 by 19 if you don't think it's difficult, and see how it goes in the Roman system. Compare that with the Arabic system. Now, I'd like to say that what Fibonacci did in restructuring our numbering system was actually a conceptual change. We can argue about that if we like, but I think it's quite a good example of conceptual change. And Fibonacci makes a proposal about how to label numbers, how to refer to numbers, and how to manipulate numbers. And by so doing, he transforms mathematics. Now, that kind of change, I want to say, it doesn't just happen with trans women and trans man and woman. It doesn't just happen with our ethically thick concepts. It happens right across the board. And there's nothing wrong with it. Such changes can be very beneficial, as Fibonacci's changes were, and they can bring huge social, political, conceptual transformation in their wake for the better. So this idea that you get, again, from people like Rod Liddell, that there's something new about this idea of shaking our traditional concepts and threatening everything. Everything was going just fine until these nasty trans activists came along and tried to change everything with their new innovations and their strange ideas. It's going on all the time, and it's going on everywhere. Conceptual change is natural and perfectly healthy and not to be worried about. Since I'm almost out of time, I'll switch to my last example. I have elsewhere written about the adoption analogy, thinking about adoptive parents as a way of thinking about trans women. Adoptive parents did not give birth to the child that they parent, but they have the status of parents. Society makes space for them. And if society can do that, society can certainly give social space and conceptual space to trans women and trans men, if it chooses to. That's the key point. What do we choose to do? Last thought then, I am, amongst other things, a member of the independence movement in Scotland. And there used to be stickers that you saw on cars in Scotland that said, "I'm a real Scot from Dundee," or whichever town it was. I happen to live in Dundee. There was this old definition of what it was to be Scottish that was all shortbread tins and tartans and bagpipes and haggises and Sean Connery and Brian Cox and blood and soil and glens and bens and neeps and tatties, and if you didn't have a strong Scottish accent and ginger hair, like Mr. What's-His-Name in The Simpsons, then you weren't a true Scot. And it was all about being a true Scot. And it was all about gatekeeping and exclusion. Now, the modern independence movement, I wouldn't be part of it if it was like that still. But it isn't about that kind of exclusivity, and it isn't about that kind of ethnic nationalism anymore. Nicola Sturgeon said in a speech at one of the S&P conferences, I forget which, that it's not about where you come from, it's where you're going. And for Nicola Sturgeon, anyone counts as a Scot who is prepared to identify with Scotland and with the project of Scotland as a new nation, and is prepared to get their shoulder to the wheel of building that nation together. And that's what it's all about. That's what being a Scot is. And I think that's a much healthier definition of what it is to be a Scot. Notice that it's not anything to do with genes or ethnicity or blood and soil or proving who your ancestors were. It's about becoming welcomed into a community which is prepared to embrace people and to reach out to people instead of putting up the barriers in a kind of scared and frightened and exclusivist way. And so amongst my various identities, I count myself as an adopted Scot, and I'm very glad to do so, even though I was born in Lancashire and I don't look or sound very much like a typical Scot. But that's the thing. Concepts change. And what's more, concepts can and do change as we want them to and as we choose them to. So that's my question about trans inclusivity. What do we actually want? Because it's not like we're forced into a corner by the metaphysics. It's up to us what we do. So I hope we'll choose the right way. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much. That's really great, really interesting. I'm going to continue now. So just to say thanks to everyone for inviting me to this great event. I'm really happy to be part of it. So today I'm going to talk about feminism and intersectionality, women writers of color. And what I thought I would do is just really take a couple of examples of women writers of color and really show the way in which they highlight issues of feminism and intersectionality. Okay, so invoking the term intersectionality, I am, of course, referring to Kimberly Crenshaw's ideas that engage with the fact that many of our social justice problems, like racism and sexism, are often overlapping and therefore creating multiple levels of social injustice. And I think Crenshaw's real insight is that women of color, like many other socially marginalized people all over the world, face all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, that is, intersections of race, of class, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism, and that all of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique. And I think for Crenshaw, intersectionality raises our awareness of the complex ways we live our lives and their challenges. And I think in this context, women writers of color can be especially helpful to us to consider and bear witness and enable us to bear witness to the often painful realities that we would rather just not confront, the everyday violence and humiliation that many women across color, age, gender expression, sexuality, have to face. But a little context before turning to the writers themselves. What we now think of intersectional feminism, of course, owes much to the kind of early Black feminism. As the American writer and civil rights activist Audre Lorde made clear in 1979, Black feminism is not white feminism with a black face. And Lorde went on to argue, and I quote, "Black women have particular and legitimate issues which affect our lives as Black women, and addressing those does not make us any less Black." But Lorde is also then, contesting the assumption that feminism is a white, westernized phenomenon. But with regards to intersectionality, Lorde also said, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." So in focusing on sexual and political struggles in Black culture in relation to the legacy of the civil rights movement and the historical context of slavery, Black American feminists such as Lorde, but all other activists like Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, Alice Walker, they all produced a significant challenge to mainstream Western feminism. And I think the academic field of post-colonial feminism, so something that I work on, produced another important challenge to mainstream feminism, an intervention spearheaded primarily by academics of South Asian origin, and that focused on the legacy of colonialism and empire, the collusion of patriarchy and colonialism. So from the 1980s, this emergent field of post-colonial feminist scholarship marked a rising discontent with what we would say first world, usually white feminism, and its assumptions of a shared marginality centered in gender, but where questions of race, of class, of caste, of language, religion, etc., remained relatively unaddressed. And I think these movements are still, post-colonial feminism is still, redefining these prominent disciplinary formations of post-colonial and feminist studies, each in its double role as a kind of institutional discourse and political movement. In 1991, Chandra Talpabir Mohanty wrote a path-breaking essay entitled Under Western Eyes, Feminist Scholarship and Colonial Discourses that still has resonance for us, even though we do not now use the category of third world women in the way that she does. So Mohanty's argument is twofold: how some strands of white feminism can be seen as a form of neocolonialism, and the blind spots, the assumptions of the oppression of women and of color means that Western feminists alone then become the true subjects of this counter history, and that women of color, on the other hand, never rise above this debilitating generality of their object status. But with regards to intersectionality, I think Mohanty is contesting and problematizing this idea of the collapsing of difference. She's insisting then that women of color, like any other group, and I think we've said that in the paper earlier, do not constitute some automatic unitary group, nor can they have any group of women cannot have a coherent group identity. And that it's essential then to be thinking about their unique contexts, their internal alliances and divisions of class, of race, religion, sexual identification, and their history. And so again, it's this idea about alliance and division, I think, this idea of multiple overlapping, but sometimes colliding constituents. Okay, so just to turn to some women writers, I want to suggest really that some pioneering early Black British women writers, such as Buchi Emecheta and Beryl Gilroy, who arrived in Britain in the 1950s and 60s, can be seen as intersectional feminists, if you like, avant la lettre, before even the term, took on, in a sense that they wrote incipient intersectional feminist text. Both writers, Gilroy and Emecheta, published in the 1970s, but they're evoking the harsh settlement period that they came in post-war Britain, that they found themselves when they moved here in the 50s and 60s, where spaces for narration have become narrower, publishing opportunities more restricted, and they began to resist being located as second-class citizens in the imagined post-war community of Britain. As was apparent after Enoch Powell's notorious Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, questions of art and politics and race could no longer remain separate, as many writers began to actively contest their marginal locations and talk about the widespread institutional racism that they continued to face. Beryl Gilroy, born in 1924 in what was then British Guyana, moved to Britain in the 50s, where she became the first Black head teacher in London. She's, of course, the mother of the academic Beryl Gilroy and his sister Darla. And she wrote about these personal experiences of teaching in London, the challenges that she faced as a Black female teacher in her novel, Black Teacher, published in 1976. And I think she touched on a range of what we would now call intersectional issues in terms of personal and institutionalized racism, but also the different effects of race and class on her Black and white pupils, the effects of cultural differences at home and on children's behavior in multicultural London as well. Buchi Emecheta, who's born in 1944 in Lagos in Nigeria, I think writes even more self-consciously, focusing on the intersections of race, gender, and class. Her husband traveled to London to attend university, and in 1962, Emecheta joined him with their 2 young children. More children followed. But after Emecheta's husband burnt the manuscript of what would have been her first novel, she left him and set about raising her 5 small children all alone, finding employment as a library assistant while studying at night before earning a sociology degree at London University in 1974. So her writings chronicled in the unhappiness of her marriage. In her novel, Second Class Citizen, published in 1974, Ada, who is Emecheta's alter ego, is challenged by not only her race, but atrocious living conditions and a violent husband. And she finds refuge in her dream of becoming a writer. So these early vivid documentary novels, In the Ditch as well as Second Class Citizen, really are about a young Black single mother living in the slums of North London. So, very much intersectional text. She's looking at forms of, in her later work, looks at forms of gendered exploitation and oppression in both Lagos and in London, and the contrasts and continuities between them. But she's also interested in gender and class and race, the welfare system on both Black and white subjectivities. But what about more recent women of color? Let's consider Bernardine Evaristo's exploration of the intersectional issues of gender identification, race, class, and sexuality in her Booker Prize-winning novel, Girl, Woman, Other, published in 2019. Evaristo said that she wanted to write an array of Black British female protagonists in her novel to show multiplicity as a weapon against invisibility. She wanted to place all her characters on an equal footing to depict the spread of who we are and who we can be. I think this is the power of literature, I suppose, is to imagine both of those things. So she depicts Black women of different generations, faiths, classes, politics, and heritage, and how they move through the world in different decades. Various characters in her novel have different relationships to and understandings of feminism, showing that though they're all women, of course, the feminist movement is complex and can mean distinct things to different people. The characters Amma, Dominique, and Nzinga, and other characters of their generation are more closely aligned with the second wave feminist movement, and particularly with Nzinga's involvement in feminist separatist communities. And their interpretation of feminism contrasts with the subsequent generations, as represented by Amma's daughter Yaz. Yaz doesn't identify with the word feminist, emphasizing instead the idea that gender is a socio-cultural construction, and she prefers to call herself a humanist. And there's a humorous passage when Amma reflects on her daughter Yaz in chapter 1. And Amma says, "Nor is the child she raised to be a feminist, calling herself one lately. Feminism is so herd-like," Yaz told her. "To be honest, even being a woman is passé these days. We had a non-binary activist at uni called Morgan Malenga who opened my eyes. I think we're all going to be non-binary in the future, neither male or female, which are gendered performances anyway. Which means that your women's politics, Mumsy, will become redundant. And by the way, I'm humanitarian, which is on a much higher plane than feminism. Do you even know what that is?" So of course, this is representing the generational differences, not only between Yaz and Amma, but also between different generations of feminists and activists. And Yaz's opinions, more maybe popular amongst millennials, perhaps, where Amma is supposed to be representing characters of a previous generation. And there's a wry look at the way young people are often impatient towards the activists that came before them, but there's also ways in which the older generation are finding their views and philosophies to be outdated. So I think Evaristo is trying to kind of reflect these changing attitudes towards feminism, as well as contemporary shifts in our collective understanding of gender and what it can mean to identify as a woman. Dominique, one character, particularly resents what she sees as a commodification of younger contemporary feminists. But for younger characters, Dominique represents an older generation of feminists who is not intersectional enough, who excludes trans women and their needs from the movement. So the novel is really enacting fault lines, if you like, of certain contemporary politics. While Girl, Woman, Other is primarily about female-identified people, it also takes an intersectional feminist approach by including the narrative of Megan Morgan. Assigned female at birth, Morgan transitions to using gender-neutral pronouns and identifies as gender-free, and begins to fall under these umbrellas of non-binary and gender-conforming. I think by including a gender non-conforming narrative, Evaristo at least wants to explore the more nuanced and multifaceted aspects of gender, what that can be, and what the experience of womanhood feminism might look like for different people. So finally, how do these contemporary and older feminist fictions by women and writers of color, how do they feed into current debates on the relationship between feminism and race, for example? What role can any literary text really play with regard to the rise of popular feminism, manifested in the Me Too and other movements, feminisms that we could say have come to the fore in part to combat the intensified misogyny that we've been talking about? Or is there even a space for cross-cultural, intersectional feminist solidarity in a context where racial divisions seem increasingly more entrenched, especially in a post-Brexit Britain, which has seen the rise of a resurgent narrow nationalism and intolerance, where the very idea of multiculturalism is under siege, and then, of course, in the context of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2017, British Social Attitudes, a survey, recorded a significant increase in the number of people who were happy to admit their own racism. And it was in this context that the Black British feminist Rennie Edo-Lodge wrote her influential book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, in 2017. So Edo-Lodge is defining structural racism then as an impenetrably white culture where anyone who falls outside the culture must conform or face failure. This is what structural racism looks like. It's not just about personal prejudice, but the collective effects of bias. And Edo-Lodge is interestingly skeptical about cross-racial feminist alliances. Whitewashed feminists are a particular source of frustration, and she devotes a chapter to feminism in her book. And here she defines whitewashed feminists as, I quote, women espousing feminist politics as they buy into the politics of whiteness. Those who acknowledge patriarchy, but struggle to understand whiteness as a political structure in the same way, end quote. And Lodge goes on to argue that, she says, my blackness, she says, is as much part of my womanhood and I can't separate them. For minority women then, intersectionality, as for many women, is a lived experience, not a feminist theory. And without doubt, I think feminism is becoming fractured in a time when we need to come together in terms of race, but also class, location, first world, third world, global north, global south. But it seems to me that some of these divisions are reflected in the widespread spectrum of what constitutes feminist multicultural literature. And I think these multicultural texts can add a global perspective to versions of feminism as they renegotiate the relationship between the personal and the political. Moreover, in her book, Edo-Lodge speaks of the gulf of emotional disconnect that she argues some white people display when a person of color articulates their experience. She's addressing those who refuse, perhaps, to accept the existence of structural racism and its symptoms. However, my own view is, I feel very optimistically about the power of literature to bridge this gulf of emotional disconnect that she identifies. My own experience teaching a range of students from the time I studied and did my PhD at Oxford, taught at Brunel, and now for over a decade now at King's, I have come across many students who are prepared to confront their own privilege and their prejudices, who do see or begin to see who benefits from their race, class, or gender, who is affected by negative stereotyping of theirs, and on whom power and privilege is bestowed, not just because of their race, but because of their class and gender identifications. I think many students do have an instinctive sense of these issues of intersectionality. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for those two really fascinating contributions. I'm delighted and slightly in fear and trepidation of following both Sophie Grace's and Rivani's contributions. I'm here to talk from a legal profession perspective and a sort of a law academic discipline perspective. And I think, well, firstly, I'm a lawyer by background, but secondly, I always think there is something particularly problematic, extremely problematic, where you can see that it's not possible to get into and advance within a profession on the basis of genuine merit when that profession is the guardian of the rule of law and is consequently supposed to embody all the principles of non-discrimination in a way which goes to the very heart of what it is to be a member of that disciplinary community. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a few different things. I'm going to quickly go through just some numbers, just to give some context about who's in the profession at different stages, just to give a sort of a thumbnail sketch of the diversity of the profession, which is great in many respects. The profession has diversified hugely, but we start to see some of those challenges playing out at different stages of entry into and progression within the profession. And I think it's important that we just take a brief look at that and some of those intersections as between, and I'm today just going to focus on gender, race and class. We do have some data on disability. We do have some data in the context of identity. We have some in the context of sexual orientation. But I'm going to focus on those three today simply because that's what our there's a limit to what we can cover in one session. And then a little bit about what we know to be blockers and what that says about solutions, what that says about struggle, what that says about our responses, and then a few things I think hopefully for all of us to have a think about in terms of our own practice, because there are some really interesting questions about what is talent and what is merit, which in the limited time that we've all got, I hope that we may be able to get to at the end. So where do I want to start? Well, many of the people I know that will be here today won't have law as their disciplinary background, and it might be helpful to know that the vast majority of people who go into the legal profession in England and Wales will do an undergraduate or equivalent law qualification, usually at a university. They'll then go on at the moment and do up to a 1-year vocational training programme, legal practice course to be a solicitor, bar course to be a barrister. There are a few other routes in to the professions, and there are more than 2 branches. And then after that, they will need to get into a law firm or into a barrister's chambers in order to do a period of work-based learning, which they'll be paid for, before they are qualified and classed as capable, therefore, of being fully fledged. Now, this is important because when we look at gender representation and minority ethnic racial representation and class representation, we see quite different profiles at different stages of the profession. So it sometimes surprises people to know that 64% of law graduates are female. So we have a really high percentage of women as the graduating cohort. We also have a very high minority ethnic percentage compared to the national census-based data. And of course, that's fairly out of date with us coming up to now, the next census, them happening every 10 years, but nonetheless. And obviously, we also do have a large number of overseas students who come into UK universities, some of whom will be classed as white, some of whom will self-define as white, some of whom will define as minority ethnic of various different backgrounds. But about 38% of law graduates would consider themselves to be part of a minority ethnic group, which is much higher than the national population. So diversity is looking pretty good there in some respects. And in terms of social background, we really only have data that comes through from the Higher Education Statistical Academy, HESA, on that, because it's quite difficult to categorise a social class in a way, and socioeconomic group in a way that's meaningful to people. But when you look at law as a discipline compared to many of the other disciplines, there is actually a higher proportion of those who are classed to be in lower socioeconomic groups than in many other disciplinary areas, certainly in the rest of the humanities. So there is quite a diversity, quite a wide range of background and very good representation in the cohort that goes through and successfully completes undergraduate law degrees. However, what you see up through those additional stages is what's often referred to as a leaky pipeline. And it's not so much a leaky pipeline as a series of blockers, which means that people get knocked out of the system as you work your way through vocational legal education onto training contracts, pupilages, and then potentially up through the levels such that they get to a stage where they start to get a degree of power, decision-making power, to make decisions about who the next group are going to be that come up through. Because usually hiring decisions are made by relatively senior members of staff in organisations, whether that's pupillage committees or whether that's training contract committees. And unless you have a relatively diverse pool of people at those senior levels, a degree of groupthink is likely to persist. However hard people try, and in some cases people will be trying hard to try and counterbalance that, in other circumstances people won't necessarily even be clear that they are thinking in a very one-track fashion. So what do we know then? Well, what we know is that a number of the blockers that affect those from different minority ethnic groups start to kick in very, very early. They start to kick in very, very early before they get to university, in part because of their social class. Now, class and race are not correlated perfectly, but we do know in British society that as a result of low pay in certain sectors, it can be difficult for a range of people to get to schools where they can have the best educational experience such that they can maximise their chances of success in standardised school tests, which will then allow them entry into certain types of university. And we know that the university one attends is a very strong predictor about the extent to which you are going to be able to get into that final stage, that employment-based stage as a lawyer, because we know that many law firms have historically used, and many pupillage and many chambers have historically used the university that one has gone to and one's A-level grades as predictors for excellence as a lawyer. They're proxies for success, but they're proxies riddled with challenges that privilege some and therefore exclude others. Having said that, those law graduates from minority ethnic backgrounds who have been to the right kinds of institution all have done tremendously well in their studies, and so have stellar, as opposed to the same as those people who are privileged, grades, often will find their challenge is modelling the kind of behaviour which will give rise to them being recognised as one of us within the profession at the point when decisions are being made about hiring. So how does one appear in a way which is recognised such that your merit, your excellence, your potential is noticed, is seen, and is then translated into a job? Because that final stage is a stage that for which gatekeepers are members of the profession themselves, not educational institutions, it's members of the profession. What do we know in the context of gender? Well, we know that the pipeline looks really very good all the way up through into the early stages of professional career. But we also know that satisfaction from female lawyers starts to go down about 3 years in. And again, that's partly juggling different responsibilities, but it's also partly about whether or not their contribution is being recognised. To what extent is them doing the relationship management work in a way which keeps clients seen differently from those who bring in work, who land clients as opposed to keep clients? To what extent is the work that they're doing behind the scenes being recognised in the way that some of the more obvious endeavours are being recognised? Now, of course, these are quite essentialist ways of putting things, but when you talk to women in the profession about their lived experience, the thing that comes through quite strongly is that my work isn't valued as much. I think my contribution is at least equal. I am not being seen. I am not being heard. And over time, that erodes the extent to which somebody wishes to remain within the profession. There are lots of other reasons as well, but there is a problem of not being seen, their work not being seen, their contribution not being seen. If we look at class as a background, what is it there that starts to knock people out of the pipeline? Getting into university isn't in and of itself the issue. Getting on to the next stage of training, however, the vocational stage, requires a significant financial input unless they're being sponsored by a firm. So going on to do the legal practice course, going on to do the bar course is going to require a large amount, £15,000 to £18,000, in order to invest before they can get into a law firm, into chambers. And for some, that is far too much. For those who have been picked out by law firms and pupillages, that may be being paid for them. But for others, they have the double whammy of no guarantee of a job, and they're also paying for that themselves. And so then it's trying to get into the firm, trying to get into chambers. And again, the issue is, are they seen? Is their talent recognised? Are they modelling the kind of attributes, the kinds of way of being, which are noticed as being professionally relevant to that firm, as desirable? To what extent is the firm or chambers alive to issues about some of those things being more a function of background than their ability to perform? So in all three instances, we have issues where people are saying, I'm not recognised. There are some structural barriers in the sense of financial barriers. There are some barriers in the context of whether or not I can perform in a way that's recognised. And then there are some barriers to the extent to which my contribution is seen and valued in a way that is commensurate to others. And all of those circumstances then intersect along the way if one has a number of backgrounds which lead to either a privileging or a diminishing of one's potential contribution. Okay, so what does that actually mean in practice in the context of the legal profession or any other profession to that extent? Well, some of the work I do is to advise on proxies. We all use proxies all the time, and proxies are the way for us to try to address uncertainty. If we are able to see with certainty that somebody is an excellent lawyer, assuming that we can agree on what an excellent lawyer is, then we can make an assessment. If we've had somebody working with us for a period of time and we can look at what they're doing and we know them or we know their work, we may be able to make a sensible assessment, leaving to one side a second the fact that what we think of as excellent is partly seen through our lens of we're excellent, they're like us, therefore they must be excellent. Leaving that to one side for a second. However, in most of these instances, we're having to make a decision based on relatively limited data. We're having to decide whether or not this person is likely to be able to do well on our law degree programme, whether this is somebody who is likely to do well on their vocational programme, and whether this is somebody who, in a competitive market, we would want to hire before we've had the opportunity to know whether or not they're an excellent lawyer. And we're doing that in a very competitive environment where we have far fewer places than we have applicants, and where we don't have that many resources in order to be able to gather infinite data on all of these candidates. So what we do is we fall back on proxies. We fall back on, well, lawyers are very intelligent, we hope. Lawyers should be able to perform at a very high level, we hope. Same with many professional backgrounds. So what will be a good proxy? I know how they've done before educationally. How do we know how they've done well before? Oh, we'll look at A-levels. How do we know how good they are? Oh, well, they went to a, quotes, great university, so they must be good. If they managed to do well there, they must be good. Well, they came in for an interview, or they came to an assessment centre and they could speak very well, and they were able to communicate in a way which was, dexterous. They were socially easy. They were able to perform. So they have the edge. So we're constantly assessing people on the basis of proxies for excellence. We're not necessarily breaking down what is it to be an excellent lawyer in our firm for this kind of role and coming up with criteria that allow us to question our decisions, not question candidates, but question our assumptions about what it is to be a contributor who will make a difference in our organisation. And that's, I think, where law firm diversity becomes extremely important. What we know is, in order to counterbalance some of those prejudices that we all have, and those structural prejudices around groupthink, we need tension. We actually need a degree of friction. And friction is about challenge. Friction is about having people of different viewpoints being able to ask others to justify their thinking, and for people to be in an environment where they can step away from some of the things they thought before, and to be able positively to say, do you know what, you're probably right. I'm thinking A-level grades maybe not a great way of judging whether somebody would be a great lawyer. That may be more a function of their background, the school they went to. Or, okay, we've got these candidates here, we can't agree on them. So what's our equal tie-break consideration? Do we therefore, if we have a group who are equally qualified, decide to go with the underrepresented group within our firm. But that's only possible if we can have very open communications. That's only possible if we're prepared to challenge our prejudices. It's only possible if we're prepared to walk away from proxies. And that's hard. It's hard when resources are tight. Now, I'm delighted to say, and I'll conclude on this, that some law firms and some barristers' chambers are doing extremely well at this. They are now walking away from many of the old ways of doing things, and they have seen a blossoming of the diversity within their organisations as a result. So it's possible to make it work, but it does require concerted effort from all of us, all of the time, to prevent us backsliding. And I think that's what I'd like to end on.
Thank you so much, all three speakers. That was a really impressive set of presentations, demonstrating time and again the importance of both lived experience, personal experience, as well as professional experience and disciplinary expertise. And I think we saw that from each of the contributors. There's been a lively number of questions in the Q&A so far, and I encourage people to keep posting questions. But maybe I'll start with the one that seems to speak to all three panelists, and maybe you could answer it in turn. And this is an attendee who asks that we seem on this panel to share a commitment to promoting a more and diverse, fair society, and it needs to be a collective decision in order to bring about change. How do you encourage these ideals both within the academy and in the public more widely? And maybe I'll start with Ruvani there, because Ruvani, you spoke so eloquently about your experience as a teacher, as being important to your experience as a woman of colour as well, to your lived experience. So perhaps start with Ruvani and then we'll open it up to the others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of what I would suggest is what we learn at schools, the whole rethinking of our national curriculum, the literary texts that we use, but also, I would be contesting this idea that this is something that we have to do just for the students of color or the ethnic minority students. I think it's something that all our students really, need to engage with. And, whiteness is something that is never really, constructed and deconstructed. So I think it's, that's really, how I would think about it as a start to have these conversations, and that really, everybody has a role to play in the classroom, and it's not the preserve of one or other group of students to, have to speak or to have solutions to the problems in any sense, but that, that to see it as a more of a collective engagement, and that to think of identity politics as something really, in a way, less divisive. I think that I hope that, by the end of sort of, a 3-year degree somewhere, that students will and particularly we'll get a sense of those issues. And I think, particularly in a discipline, like literature, which is really about empathy, it's about putting yourself in the shoes of a character or a person that, you don't have that whole experience. It seems to me the ideal tool for that kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I could turn to Sophie Grace at this point and invite a response to that question about collectivity and social and academic change or educational change.
Well, we have two questions I see in the chat, in the Q&A, about how to achieve social change. And there's so many angles you can come at that from. And Ruvani's quite right to talk about the potential of fiction writing for social change and for changing the way we imagine things, our imaginaries, the way we conceptualize each other. One thing I'd like to talk about, if it's not too blokey, is football. Because I think it's very strange in our society that although we see ourselves as so liberated and enlightened in so many ways, still, Arsenal beat Chelsea means Arsenal men beat Chelsea men. And it's still almost impossible in a sport I'm very interested in, rugby. It's almost impossible there for people to come out as gay. It's very difficult in football for people to come out as gay, and whether they're male or female. So it would be lovely if, 5 years down the track, Arsenal, we see headlines like Arsenal men beat Chelsea men, and the qualification is needed because they're equally famous, they're getting the same amounts of cash, ridiculous amounts of cash going to both sides of the gender divide, and it's part of the way society sees women, that their sport is not secondary. It's not second-class sport. It's not an add-on extra. It really counts in the way that men's sport counts at the moment. So, men's football becomes synonymous with football. I think that it's that kind of invisible, I was talking about conceptual divisions, that kind of invisible way in which we divide up the world. We don't even notice it because we're so used to it. That's the kind of stuff we need to change.
Thank you. As somebody who's very familiar with Twickenham and with the tiny stadium for women's rugby as opposed to the stadium for men's rugby, I completely endorse that. And I hear you on social practices of inclusion and exclusion, as well as the more specific educational aspects where you can challenge as well as and think about inclusion and exclusion.
The thing I sometimes say is the sound of a successful prejudice is silence. Yeah. It's all the things we don't even notice we're doing that we need to change.
That's a very wise summary, if I can put it that way. Lisa, give us some more thoughts on this particular question, because you're coming of social change writ large, as it were, because you're coming at it, you gave this paper very much rooted in the legal profession, but so much of what you had to say seemed to me to chime with my experience of being a university academic, the experience that I have in trying to train up young academics, and also the exclusionary experience that in training up young people, the assumption is that they only want to go into academia. So could you talk to those issues as well? And I'll come back.
Well, I'll try. So yes, the legal profession is and law is my area, and so it's a case study. But it is really a case study. It's no different from many other areas of endeavour. It's no different from many other professional contexts, I don't think. And I do look at the academic world as well, and it really isn't that different. So I think the key issue from my perspective is the extent to which, we need to train, obviously we need to educate people to think as broadly as we can and to challenge all sorts of underpinning assumptions which are latent and are relatively unexamined, particularly by dominant groups in society. They're often very heavily examined because they're having to be examined by groups that are excluded because they're trying as hard as they can in order to try and bypass, get round, and get some traction on some of those things. But for dominant groups, there is on the whole relatively little that's obvious unless people are educated to spot these things. But it's in part about us educating people to be able to reflect in a way that doesn't make them so uncomfortable that they just shut down. And I'm not talking about people not taking responsibility. I'm talking about an open ability to be reflexive as opposed to simply reflective. It's something we don't do at all well in my disciplinary tradition, and we're trying to change. It's something that's had to be done in the context of the medical profession. It's something I think in the academic world we're not brilliant at all, which is to from a very early age help people to be able to deal with their feelings along the way of looking at how they see the world, their practices, and then what that means for others. Because unless we get to a stage where people are able to sort of take the thing outside, look at it and think, oh, that makes me feel really uncomfortable, and I now realise that I have been, or I am, by my thoughts or my actions, causing this, and that's not what I'm committed to as a person. I actually am actively trying to improve things until we get people to a stage where they can do that and deal with their feelings about that without the sort of the very primeval bit of us going back into defensive mode and saying, no, this is not a conversation, this is ridiculous. I haven't been privileged, I'm not in a privileged place, I don't think you realise how hard it's been for me, and these horrible people over here are trying to get one up on me. Till we get past that, social change is really slow. It's not that we can't do it. We've seen that there's been progress, but we will go forward and then we will retrench, and then we might go forward a bit more and then we will retrench. And some groups will benefit, and some will be discarded. And so it's about reflexivity for me. And I think literature gives us a powerful way in which we can talk about things without it feeling quite as personal, because it's about a character or a series of characters. It's not us doing it, it's those fictional characters doing it. But I also think we need to be enabled, and we need to enable others to be able to do that themselves in a way which is freeing rather than provokes a degree of defensiveness. And that's hard. I mean, I find it difficult when I sit down and think, I've just somehow managed to get us into a position. I'm head of school. And there are times when I think I've just made it much worse for this group of people. It wasn't my intention at all. It doesn't chime with my values, but I realise I have, because I just didn't think about that at the point when I was doing that. And the antidote to that is to have a diverse team around me, and all of us able to reflect without it being so personal that we get upset by it.
Thank you. I see Sophie Grace has got the magical hand up. So
yes, I've managed to work out how to do that. I wondered if I could ask Lisa a follow-up. And forgive me, what I'm going to say, because I want to keep it brief, is going to go straight through some gender stereotypes, which I think have some truth in them, actually. So here it is. Forgive me if this causes offence. I think women and men work in a different way quite often because of the way culture enculturates us to work. I think a lot of men are very fly by the seat of the pants, very prawn sandwich lunch whilst doing 3 things at once, very still in the office at 11 o'clock at night. And I think there's macho values around this kind of behaviour. I think people are actually encouraged to be workaholics in that kind of deeply unhealthy and antisocial way. And I think also, whatever else one thinks about Brexit, I think getting rid of the working hours directive is disastrous because of the differential way that men and women work. So men get an advantage because they're prepared to do this crazy nonsense of still being in the office at 11 o'clock at night, having had nothing since 8 a.m. except a prawn sandwich. Women work in a different way. They're much more systematic, and they start from the bottom up. They do an 8 to 5 day, and then they clock off and go home, and that way they stay sane while all the men stay crazy or get crazy. Now, that's how it is in philosophy. Again, I apologise if there are gender stereotypes in there. That's how it is in philosophy. Is it like that in law? And is that an obstacle to women?
That's a really interesting one. I think there are generational differences, and I spend a bit of time in law firms and in barristers' chambers interviewing people at different ages and stages of life. And I've noted over the last maybe I was going to say 10, it's probably sort of 7 years, there is a bit of a switch. So I think the first thing to say is there is a reason why there are stereotypes, and there is some truth in the notion that that there are different performances, and so there are performances of very long hours, presenteeism, of appearing to be on call at all times, going out for a few drinks, and they are drinks, alcoholic drinks, and then coming back in, sending a few emails, making sure that one is seen. And people who are having to say, I have to go, I've got children to pick up, and yes, I'll be logging on later on, but I'm going to be logging on from home rather than in the office, so I'm not going to be as obvious. People might see the emails, but they're not going to see them in the same way, because some people saw them being sent, actually physically sent, because everybody was in the office, and mine are just emails. So there is some truth in that, and it is pretty toxic. It's the same in academic life, in law as well. It's not just in the profession. Having said that, I think what's fascinating is, firstly, a younger generation of fathers are wanting to be much more involved and are being much more vocal. And I think that working cultures are changing more as a result of the way in which fathers are asking for various flexibilities. When women asked for it, it was seen as a problem. But of course, you know, some of the men asking for it is just seen as, well, aren't they brilliant? I mean, they're just, you know, they're looking after their children. How fantastic. Which isn't viewed. How things are recognised, how things are seen are different. No, it's not true everywhere. Again, there's a stereotypes. But we're seeing some changes. We're seeing younger fathers, and younger in the sense of new fathers, saying, look, I'm not prepared to do these hours because, you know, I've got a life here, and if I can't spend some time with my children, if I can't, you know, I'm expected to drop my children off or pick them up. We share it. So there's some shifting there. That's one thing. Secondly, I think the pandemic and the way in which people have been working at home will have a bit of an impact. So there's some of that. And the third thing, which is different, is increasingly clients of particularly large law firms. A lot of what I've said is about large law firms, but not exclusively. They're the major employers of lawyers. Clients are not willing to pay by the billable hour. They're playing on a fixed fee. So having people in the office for hours and hours and hours and hours, billing extra hours, as used to be the case, there was an economic advantage. But increasingly, it's how efficiently can you get this done? Because we've got this amount of money for this case, and you spending more time on it isn't going to make us more money. So we need you to be moving on to something else instead. And that's starting to change the culture in some contexts. So I think there are some interesting things happening. I'm not saying it's solved, it isn't, but I would say that the very long hours culture is being chipped away at to an extent. And that might give us some hope.
I'm wondering now, actually, whether we'll need to do some additional work and research to recover actually what's going on in terms of working practices within the pandemic. I think I've been looking down, we seem to have picked up one way or another most of the questions, not perhaps in the wording that the questions came to us, but we have been covering those issues. But there is a couple of things that I'd quite like to conclude with, and one is to do with the pandemic itself, because it's very hard for me to sit here and reflect on inclusion and exclusionary practices without commenting on the medium, the technology that we're using today and necessarily have to. I mean, the digital sphere in which we all now have to work is not evenly accessible by all peoples, and this is a barrier, and may well be a barrier that we have to work really hard to overcome in the coming years, or at least be aware of. So I wanted to name it here, okay, that this seemed to be really important. And it would be nice, I think, looking at us, to think this is a wonderful panel, and I congratulate Natalia and Elena on the organization of it. But I am conscious that we're of a certain generation ourselves. So perhaps next time around it would be nice to mix up. And I know that the next panel is on the future of feminisms, and that will enable that. And I want to just conclude with quick thoughts from everybody. One of the things that really has struck me about this panel, however, is the importance given to welcomes, to inclusion and to welcoming practices. And I think, Ruvani, you addressed that very clearly in terms of the literary sphere. Lisa, you addressed that very clearly in terms of what can law firms do to diversify and therefore be welcoming of all kinds of peoples, because that way that will enrich all our lives. And Sophie Grace, you started with a welcome, and you threaded that through your whole presentation, for which I thank you, because I think you set the tone for this panel. So if there is one thing that you each do to welcome, what is it to welcome difference? And one thing that you do in your daily life or in your working life to be inclusive and welcoming, what do you think it is? And that's what's called silencing people. Perhaps we'll start with Ruvani. put you on the spot.
I mean, I'm sort of writing this paper with one hat on as being kind of A&H, equality and diversity lead, and I've been doing a lot of work on kind of inclusive staffing, and I think that's really the change we need to see a more diverse staff, and not simply in race, but first generation students, and the more nebulous aspects of class, because that's something that's not covered in the Equality Act, and that's something universities must deal with. So that would be one thing I would say.
So let's hear it for hiring practices. In inclusive hiring practices. Sophie Grace.
I was going to say, I think a very simple thing that you can do is look people in the eye and smile at them. And then my silence caused, and that sounds so small, but I think it makes a lot of difference. My silence was caused by trying to think what the online analogue of that is. And obviously in this situation, it is looking at people and smiling at them. I think one online analogue of just welcoming body language towards other people is probably using names. So when you're talking with someone, you just use their name in read and write or whatever it is. And I think that can make a huge difference, because especially if you're talking across an ethnic divide, then the fact that you're able to pronounce someone's name even though they're not from your language group, I think that can make people feel welcome where otherwise they wouldn't. And it's interesting, of course, coming at these things from my perspective, because people are sort of primed to see me either as a problem or as an exception because I'm transgender. And I don't see that. I see them, not myself. So, it's interesting interacting with people on that basis. You get funny reactions sometimes. But you try to be welcoming. That's the key thing.
Lisa, with your surname as Webley, you do get the last word in this section.
Thank you. It's being a W. I think, so I would agree with everything that's been said so far. I think also giving people active permission to correct you, correct me. I get things wrong all the time. I'm not very good at pronouncing people's names. I'm not very good at remembering names. It's a weakness, and I'm aware of it. Giving people permission and being very upfront, not as an excuse, but to say, please do correct me. If I say this wrong, please do correct me. If I don't call on you and you have something to say, please do, stick your hand up, wave at me. It won't be deliberate, but that doesn't mean it's appropriate. So please, please do. And what I hope that means is that people feel a little less uncomfortable, and therefore we can then have an open conversation. So I try to do that. That doesn't mean I always manage it.
And with that, with a smile, a recommendation for change of practices, and a recommendation and an invitation to correct, I'd like to thank our panelists and our audience today. Invisible though you are, I've really enjoyed reading your questions, and I can see how much you've actively engaged with the panel today. And thank you so much indeed. Thanks to our organisers, and I hope we will see you back here at 4 o'clock for the future of feminism. I don't know what we were doing, but that's my utopian moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you.